much-coveted collective planetary goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement, could fail dramatically by the year 2100, a new study has warned. The study by the Climate Action Tracker has said global temperatures will rise 2.7 degrees Celsius or 4.9 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels by that year. This would prove catastrophic for billions of people, posing frequent existential level dangers such as extreme weather events including heat waves, storms, droughts, and floods, which are already being experienced now. The report was issued on the sidelines of the ongoing 29th session of the Conference of the Parties, or COP29, in Baku, Azerbaijan. To understand what the report means for the world, MCR spoke to its lead author, Sofia Gonzales-Zuñiga, Senior Climate Policy Analyst at Climate Analytics, based in Berlin. Welcome to my entire report, Sofia. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you. Your latest update that you issued on the sidelines of COP29 says, and I'm going to quote a little bit for the benefit of my viewers, the combined global effect of government action on climate change has flatlined over the last 3 years, underscoring a critical disconnect between the reality of climate change and the lack of urgency on policies to cut emissions, unquote. What are some of the main reasons behind this apathy, you think?
Yeah, so what we analyze in the report is that there's apparently two opposing trends that are counterbalancing each other. So on the one hand, we had very positive news throughout the year that renewable energy and electric vehicles have been at record breaking levels. So that was really encouraging and really positive. However, we also saw that fossil fuel subsidies remain at the all-time high, and the same for funding that goes into fossil fuel prolonging projects. So that has also increased almost 4 times over the last year. So although there are very positive developments in renewable energy, the impacts are actually not seen because the other force is still very much present right there.
You know, you're projecting a rise of 3 degrees instead of the much coveted 1.5 degrees. That's an astonishing number. Are we heading for a huge catastrophe?
Yeah, so once again, like this is something that we keep on reporting year after year, and the number that you were referring to is under a scenario based on our current policies that we have to say. So that's based on the policies that are in place today. We are heading towards warming of 2.7 degrees with a 50% chance. But yeah, this is far away from the 1.5 goal that we had set at the Paris Agreement. So there is like this urgent need. Now, I think it's positive that emissions are not growing anymore. So that's the positive side of this flat line. Emissions are not growing. But what we need is that they peak and decline as soon as possible.
At this point, because of a drop in the original audio, I'm repeating the sense of the question. I essentially asked Sofia about why the developing world should pay for the failures of the developed world and what happens when African countries too begin to consume energy at unprecedented levels for their development.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. So one is like already at the Paris Agreement back in 2015, all the parties agreed that they will need to bring their contribution to the table, because this cannot be solved just by a few countries. This was the context of the Kyoto Protocol was based only on those developed countries, but now it's different. So now it has been already agreed that everyone has a responsibility to bring a contribution to the table. And now it's also very clear that all nations are feeling the impacts of climate change. So I think governments have the responsibility to try and reduce the impacts in the future as much as possible, and they can only do that by controlling how much they emit. No, and the other aspect on the touching on the development, the economical development for the region in Africa, I think there's also the need to move on from this concept of economic development that goes linked to a highly carbon intensive economy. No, and so like there are some models that also explore what it would be a development in the region where instead of developing based on fossil fuels, there is the opportunity to grow based on renewables. And so it's about finding a different concept for development that works better with our planet.
One of the questions that I often grapple with is the goal of 1.5 degrees. A lot of countries may find it too ambitious and in the process may feel discouraged to just give it up. Do you think that's a factor that you recognize as you study the planet?
Well, I think what is very important about this 1.5 goal is that it's not a political goal. It's a goal that comes from the science, right? It's a recommendation that comes from the IPCC, where they say this is the threshold for our ecosystems. Beyond that, we cannot predict what will happen, and therefore we can also not predict what the effect for the economy will be. So in the end, it's all like in relation to us. But again, it's coming from the science. It's not that it was decided by a certain country. So negotiating on the physics of planet Earth doesn't really work, right?
No, I understand that, but I'm saying purely you're dealing with human psychology here, right? They look at something rather unachievable and then they give up in despair. So while
Yeah,
you say that we have to achieve 1.5, but keep in mind, even if you end up with 2, you would still do better than what we'll end up doing now, right?
exactly. That's what it is. So even if we don't get to 1.5,
Mhm.
we cannot stop trying because we know that this is our threshold, right? So we need to still stay as close as we can to it. And if it was the case, and I don't think we are there yet, that this is not achievable anymore, we would nevertheless have to continue trying to not go beyond that. I mean, just giving up would be a completely catastrophic outcome, a completely different reality for most countries, and I don't think any government wants to be in a position to having to deal with all those consequences.
I'm sure you've been tracking the COP series for a while. My question is, do you think these conferences often become sort of jamborees for world leaders to come and pontificate and then go back to doing what they are doing? Or you think it leads to something tangible or recognizable in terms of the goals that we're talking about?
So the COPs are, quite some, I don't know, mixed feelings about them. I think they definitely have an impact, and that we see in our assessment. So there is one graph that we've created looking at our projections
Mhm.
since the Paris Agreement was signed. And since then, we see that at the beginning, we were thinking that current policy predictions would lead to 3.6 degrees. And
Right,
every year, it was a little bit less, a little bit less. And that is directly impact of the Paris Agreement. So coming to these COPs, talking to each other, coming to this agreement does have an impact. And we've seen it in the temperature projections. But indeed, it feels like in the last couple of years, it has slowed down at a moment where things should be picking up. No, there should be, much more. I feel like when you're at the COP and you talk to people on the hallways, you get a sense like there's like this almost flatline type of
right,
energy, and you need people who are ready to fight, to put on ambitious targets in front of the table that bring some action, some discussions, and yet people are still not directly talking about the things that need to be discussed, like the fossil fuel phase out
right,
is something that they just go around, and in particular when it's held in countries that whose economies are heavily dependent on this. It
right.
would be a great opportunity if such a country is willing to say, we see the urgency of this and we want to get on a pathway transitioning away from it. But unfortunately, this is not the case.
Right. One of the problems is fossil fuels are such low-hanging fruit that people feel it easy to pick them and then move on. In the last 20, 30 years that I've been looking at this subject, we haven't created a parallel source which people can say, okay, this is equally reliable in terms of the sheer volume of it. Of course, you have things like solar and other different sources of energy, but people as countries don't feel that it's strong enough for them to completely rely on that as a part of the mix. I understand, but not as the primary source. How do you get around that problem?
Yeah, that goes into the technicalities a bit more, right? And I think that is part of the challenge. I think what needs to happen is like to have more support so that research can advance. But then, there's at the moment there's an unreal competition because there's subsidies for fossil fuels.
Right.
So they make it much more competitive than it actually is at the moment. So if it wasn't, there would be more resources flowing into solving those problems. And I think that could be like a turning point if that were to happen.
Apart from the US, what kind of responsibility do you think the EU, Australia, India, Indonesia, Japan, and China, these are the countries you have identified as major emitters, they bear at this stage as they pursue growth along the lines of the developed world?
Yeah, so these countries, without the US, they represent about 50% of the global emissions. So there is still like a big responsibility of reducing emissions and taking leadership in that process. So what we were asking from these countries was to try to come up with some ambitious targets, domestic action, like saying what are they going to do within their own borders and how they're going to reach it. I think that's the two things, having an ambitious target, but also having a plan with hopefully sectoral targets in place where you see how are they going to reach that.
Right. But that's where the rub lies, because India and China can turn around and argue that we account for 36% of the global population. And they can say that why is it that we are being asked to compromise when the US, with 300 odd million, is one of the biggest consumers, that's where I live, of all energy sources. It's difficult to counter an argument like that, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this is something that, comes once and again in every negotiation round. Of course, there is the history of the contributions to emissions. On the other hand, I feel like at this stage, this is also an opportunity for certain countries to try to differentiate themselves from how the US has done it. And also there is an opportunity to take a lead, because right now that position is available, let's say, right? The US wants to do things differently, wants to move in a different direction, but they will also have to deal with the consequences of that. And in the case of China and the case of India, they are dealing with the impacts of these heat waves, for example, we saw during the year. So I think it's also in their own interest to try as much as they can to reduce that in the future, and also a nice opportunity to take the lead, because would be very nice.
We have just witnessed the return of Donald Trump, who has described climate change as a hoax. What kind of concerns do you have as someone who deals with the subject day in and day out?
Yeah, I would say the day when the election results came, it was a very difficult day. It was a sad day to think that things could be rolled back, things that have been worked so hard to get. So I think it's a bit soon to say what will be the magnitude of the impact of his government. We did a very quick assessment for this report where we just basically said, if he was to implement Project 25, which is one that he's been talking about, what would be the consequences of this. And we saw that like it would lead to an around 0.04 degree of increase by the end of the century. So that's perhaps not so significant as we had feared, but this is just the effect of implementing this one set of policies that he has already mentioned. Whether he's going to roll back policies like the carbon neutrality commitment, for example, this would have a much larger effect on a global scale. And not to mention the fact that there's also, like, there was an expectation that the US would lead in terms of bringing climate finance to the table so that reductions can happen in other parts of the world. So that is a big gap now that is there. And I would really hope that other countries would step up and like fill that gap, in particular EU in that case. And then finally, it's about if other country leads would actually stay united and show the way, because Trump, he is calling for other countries to go in his direction, right? And already we saw during COP, Argentina's president, Milei, ordered his delegation to leave the COP in the middle of the process, following basically Trump's example. So this could be really damaging, but at this point, it's early to say how bad it could be.
I'm glad you mentioned the south of this country, this whole expanse of spectacularly well-endowed countries in terms of natural resources. They generally get a short shrift in terms of their impact on global policies. Even the country that I suppose you originally come from, Peru, right?
Yeah.
Incidentally, I've been so fascinated. I've been wanting to visit. Maybe someday I will. How do you think south of the US, the entire expanse of several countries, where do you think they stand generally?
Well, there are quite a few countries there that are having like some interesting commitments. So the case of Chile has put in place a whole plan to phase out coal-fired power plants. And we actually reported earlier this year that it's actually going faster than they had predicted. So they're able to phase out all of these plants faster, and that is relying on renewable energy in parallel. And there's also the case of Colombia, who is now pushing for no more oil exploration. And that is quite the thing, being a country that relies heavily on this resource. I think they're not getting the support or the visibility that they could be having, that they would actually they are, champions. They're doing it, even though their economies are sometimes or people inside are flagging that this could affect their economy.
Right.
They should be receiving all the support from the international community, and yet that's not the situation. So that is a bit of a conflict. Now you have Brazil.
Right.
Now that they are going to be hosting the COP, there's a lot of pressure on them. They are also exporters of fossil fuels, gas and oil, and yeah, having seen they are now the troika countries, right? So
Right.
UAE, Azerbaijan, and now Brazil. So all of them rely to a large extent on fossil fuels, and there is still the expectation that Brazil will try to present themselves a little bit different and try to come up with something more aggressive than the last two COPs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just last couple of things, Sofia. One is, of course, at a personal level, the country that you come from, in terms of educating the way you did, for instance, what kind of spread are we talking? Are youngsters like you interested in this line of work? Because it is very technical. It is full of science, a lot of physics involved. It's complex calculations. What is the overall scene in Peru, for instance?
So Peru, I would say it was quite of a topic. I was surprised how much we were talking about it back in 2012.
I see.
That was the first mitigation project on a national scale. They have put in place a good team in the ministry. But it is true that the country is going through a very complicated political situation that has basically frozen most of the projects, most of the progress on many of these areas, environmental topics in general, right? It has been now 2 years that we've been looking at it, and there's limited policy development. So also in terms of education, and so how much people talk about it, because now this whole political situation has taken over, and that is the reality. Like in most developing countries, you have the social aspect that many times overshadows most of the issues. But then comes climate change, and Peru is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change as well. So you have people that are struggling with drought and with floods in different parts. So it's something that there's a feeling like you cannot deal with it at the moment. At the same time, it just comes stronger every time. So not dealing with it is counterproductive. But yeah.
Right. I think recently the Chinese premier was there, right? Xi Jinping.
Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about China's influence, not just in your country, but that part of the world. Is that a concern that you have as a professional?
I mean, China is a very powerful country, and they are very fast and effective when it comes to when they decide to build infrastructure. It just happens, right? And so now they were visiting the country because there is this plan to build, I think, the biggest harbor for the region, and it will be in the north of Lima. So yeah, and I mean, it is very attractive for many developing countries because it's investment that comes without like a lot of different steps, like when you have the international settings. So yeah, I think generally it is appreciated on a national level, but yeah, there are always some concerns as to something that happens so fast. And
And plus, there is a real problem of debt trap. A lot of countries which have in Africa, even in Asia, are discovering that it's basically loan sharking countries. Once you are in that debt trap, it's difficult to get out.
Yeah, I think that is a huge risk.
Right.
With the yeah.
And finally, to conclude, a somewhat philosophical question. And my background is physics, yours is science too. So, do you think humanity understands that neither our planet, nor the solar system, nor the galaxy, nor even the universe has any particular stake in our survival as a species? We seem to think that somehow we will be saved. None of this has any stake in whether we live or not. Do you think that's something that a lot of people just don't understand?
Yeah, I think this is where this communication on the topic has been so limited to a certain extent. Right now, it was always painted as like, a certain animal that's losing its habitat, and like it goes so much further beyond that, and the disconnection between our daily actions and the consequences for ourselves, right? Because in the end, like, of course, the universe, like you said, that nothing is gonna change if we stop existing, right? It's just
Absolutely.
this is about us and avoiding the effects for us, right? But yeah, I've been in more than one situation where I have to remind people the planet is not gonna explode or anything like this. We're trying to avoid the worst possible consequences for us.
Right.
And this is where this threshold is coming from. Our economies, our ecosystems, and how we depend on these ecosystems, right? They might just develop in different ways, but for us, it will be very difficult to adapt to that new situation.